Hey guys! All right, so here we go with your first set of notes for this section titled Species. Okay, so this next unit, we are going to talk about why we see this diversity of life on this planet and how those changes can occur through our genetics and get passed on through those species over time. All right, so you can see a few images here. We are used to, obviously, the ecosystem we live in, but if you look beyond that, especially, and we've done that a little bit with some of that like animal of the week stuff, there is a crazy amount of diversity of organisms on this planet. And here are a lot of animals, but it's also in plants and fungus, protists, and especially in bacteria. Okay, so how did we get this diversity of life? How is it passed on? Those are some of the topics that we are going to be discussing. All right, so before we get into that too much, let's talk about the similarities. Okay, so obviously, when you look at just the phenotype of whatever organism, you see a huge amount of variety in life. But if you actually come down more to the like biochemistry, there is a huge amount of unity in the organisms on this planet. Okay, we've been talking a lot about genetics. Well, all the DNA for every living thing on this planet is the same. Okay, so genetic information is passed the same way. We have the same 4 bases, right? And nucleotides are all built the same way. And so it's just the order of those DNA bases that are different. And then all the other chemistry in our body, right? So the macromolecules that we studied at the beginning of the year, right? The structures of the proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, the structures of our cells, all those things are very, very similar. The chemical processes and metabolism in our body is the same. So I go through cellular respiration to get energy just like my dog does, just like my chickens do, just like a fish in the river does, or a bear, or even, something crazy different, let's say a rose bush, okay? And so we were just talking about amino acids that make proteins, right? All living things have the same amino acids. So this kind of alludes to common ancestry. And then if we look at separate groups of organisms that seem to be more closely related, we can see similarities. And I've always found this one an interesting one that's on the slide, the bone structure of different mammals. And so we are looking at 4 very different mammals, okay? And the functions of their limbs are very different. So we have a human, us, the cat, okay, a whale flipper, and a bat wing. But if you actually look at the bone structure, they all have the same bone structure. Now, maybe the joints are slightly different, or the same bones. Maybe the joints are slightly different, or they're thinner or thicker, or some parts more truncated. But really, like, what advantage would a whale have of having the same bone structure that a cat's leg has? It doesn't really probably need to be that complex for a flipper. But it does, again, allude to that common ancestry. All right, so what does it mean for an organism to be a separate species? All right, so for an organism to be considered a species, like we are the human species, my dog is the canid species, okay? So species that mean that they are so similar, they can mate and produce fertile offspring. And so a lot of this stuff we're going to be talking about with how genetics are passed on is related to a species and how that species could change in relation to that over time. And so we didn't need to have a solid idea of what it means to be a species, okay? So if those 2 organisms can mate and produce fertile offspring that then again can mate and have offspring, we consider them the same species. So a horse, Okay, even though there's a huge variety of different breeds of horses, right? There's a quarter horse, there's the thoroughbred, the Arabian, but they all can interbreed and have fertile offspring. And some of those horses are very different, right? A Shetland pony and a Shire draft horse. Very different, but they could potentially have offspring. Okay, now a donkey is a separate species from a horse. Even though they're fairly similar and they actually can have offspring, their offspring is called a mule, but the mule is sterile. So they would still be considered separate species. And that goes back to the fact that they actually have different number of chromosomes. So a mule has an odd number of chromosomes, which just messes up meiosis and fertilization after that point. So mules are typically sterile. Sometimes, though, a hybrid like a mule has some very good characteristics. And so there's a lot of different species of plants that we will do this to as well. We'll breed for the hybrid. They're very viable, but they're not going to be able to have offspring, or those offspring that they have very reduced viability. Okay. Another example, if you've ever watched Napoleon Dynamite, the liger, it's real. Okay. So a lion and a tiger can actually have offspring, have a liger, but those ligers typically are infertile. That would not happen in the wild because they live in different ecosystems, but if you bring them together, you can, in like a zoo or something, make a liger. Same with some others like a zorse. Thoughts on that one? Zebra horse. Oh, that's all I can think of right now, but there's a few other out there. Research it. All right. So, how do we get this inability for certain groups to breed with others? Okay, so how do we get these separate species? Well, we've done some studies with it. And basically, separate species come from isolation, okay? If a group is separated for a long enough time, there might be enough accumulations of genetic differences that they can no longer interbreed. And we would call that reproductive isolation, okay? Reproductive isolation can come from two groups getting geologically isolated, or, other ways like ecologically isolated, temporally isolated. And if it leads to them not being able to reproduce, it's reproductive isolation, and that could be the start of two separate species. They've actually done a study with fruit flies where they separated two groups and fed them different foods over many generations. And when they brought them back together, they did not mate with the fruit flies that ate the different food source. Weird. So that could eventually lead to enough genetic variation that at some point they wouldn't even be able to physically or genetically mate. So anyway, you can see how that could lead to separate variations or separate species. Now, a word of warning. You still can have a lot of variation in one species and they can still interbreed. Okay, it's actually weird. Some species look very, very similar. And you would think, like, there's this bird, like the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark. They look almost identical, but they are separate species and they can't interbreed. However, then you see, like, dogs, the classic example. Oh my gosh, think about all the different dog breeds, and that's just variation among a species. And lots of times we see a ton with dogs because we've messed with them through artificial selection. But in general, especially in the wild, variation is a very good thing, right? And you guys have told me this before in some of your answers to questions, but genetic variation comes from sexual reproduction, and that's an advantage, right? If you have some big event or a disease or some environmental issue, if there's more variation, there's more chance that some individuals will be able to survive and continue the species. Okay, one of the big worries with conservation and like animals that are getting down to very, very small amounts is that even if we're able to protect them and breed them up and they end up getting larger populations, it's almost like having a species of all twins because there's such low genetic diversity because they went through, and we'll talk about this in the future, what we call a bottleneck, where only a handful of that species survived. The cheetah is a great example. It's gone about 10,000 years ago. It went through a bottleneck with the Ice Age where only, a small percentage survived. And now it's gone through another one through poaching and loss of habitat where cheetahs are all very, 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 very genetically similar. And that's not a good thing. Okay. Dogs on the flip side of that, huge amount of variation, right? Think Chihuahua, Great Dane, Golden Retriever, Poodle. I mean, it's just crazy the amount of variation. Okay. And for any of you, though, those, I always tell people that are like, oh, I don't think species really change. I think dogs are a great example because I don't think anyone could picture a herd of Chihuahuas roaming the plains 10,000 years ago. No, we've manipulated their genetics and they have changed over time. Okay. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it today. So get those in your notes. And then tomorrow I will finish up the second half of those notes. Okay. All right. Talk to you then. Have a good day. Bye.